Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight we're diving into lore behind the Deathmongers, Chaos Space Marines, formerly known as the Brothers of the Anvil. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment any videos or topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor or their Dark Gods. I want to thank you guys for support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get to the video.
Orbital night over Basilica Mortis had always possessed a grandeur that made lesser men weep. The shrine world was a cathedral cast upon the void, its hive spires reared up like iron scripture, its processional causeways burning with rivers of devotional light, its upper atmosphere threaded by the patient movement of pilgrim craft. Cargo lighters, mass conveyors, chapel barges, relic haulers, and void ferries drifted in sanctioned lanes above the world, each vessel bright with shrine lamps and prayer beacons, each one fat with labourers, penitents, confessors, mendicants, bondserfs, and the countless nameless wretches who spent their entire blood-bought lives crawling towards one holy precinct or another. Then the dark between the stars opened, and grey ships came through. They did not emerge with the stately certainty of imperial battle groups. They arrived like old hatreds, dragged into real space by chain hooks. Their silhouettes were long and predatory, all spinal ridges and plated. Brutality, their flanks ridged with brass-trimmed armour blackened by the furnace breath of overdriven engines. Their prows were not adorned with aquilae or sanctified heraldry. They bore skullwork, butcher hooks, split helms, and iron scripture hammered over older, forgotten devices. Furnace light bled from launch bays and view slits, turning the hulks into floating crematoria. Even at great distance, Basilica Mortis seemed to recoil beneath their coming. Aboard the flagship Judgment of Iron, Severin Hale hung in his restraint harness above the vox pit and tasted copper in the back of his throat. The chamber around him was vast, vaulted, and dim with machine haze. Brass sensor cages swung above banks of rune screens. Cherub servitors, half flensed and trailing incense smoke, drifted in slow patrol arcs between suspended vox arrays. The walls had once been clean ceramite. They were not clean now. Skin scrolls stitched with blasphemous battle litanies drooped between iron buttresses. Skulls had been mortared into the deck edges in mocking imitation of saintly reliquaries. Somewhere below the grating beneath Severin's bare feet, coolant ran in thick pipes with the sound of arterial blood. His wrists were locked to data manacles. A spine jack was seated in the back of his neck. He served because he had not died yet. The first hails from Basilica Mortis were formal and outraged. Identification demands, challenge runes, liturgical warnings invoking void quarantine and the penalties of trespass beneath the authority of the ecclesiarchy. Then came the panic spikes as auger stations marked weapons hot. Then the layered overlap of civilian distress traffic as pilgrim captains saw what the defense grid had seen. Severin heard it all. The vox pit made a man hear too much. He heard a shuttle master crying for guidance while children wailed in the compartment behind him. He heard the hard edge in a station prefect's voice as he ordered defense batteries to stand ready. He heard a priest aboard some passing chapel barge continue a benediction for almost a full minute after the first macro round struck, his voice never quite grasping that he had already died. Then the internal command channels opened. Not raid instructions, not seizure orders, not the clipped greed of pirates marking fuel stores and slave lots. Kill orders, exemplary ruin, reactor breaches authorized, civic vox suppression, civilian traffic priority target, no salvage before saturation. Severin closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He had been on ships that came to steal. He had been on ships that came to feed. He had been on ships that came to make examples. This was not any of those. This was sentence. This was judgment pronounced in the language of macro shells. The strategium doors boomed apart. Every thrall, serf, and augur slave in the chamber flinched, though none dared raise his head fully. They entered like an execution itself. The Deathmongers wore grey warplate, darkened by old soot and newer blood. Brass trim glimmered along plate edges and vent housings. Spikes rose from shoulders and backpacks, some bearing chains of finger bones and knucklebone rosaries, others bearing the cracked skulls of saints, officers, and lesser Astartes. Their helms were brutal masks. Some were tusked, some were skull-faced. Some had been hammered and reworked so often that their original forge lines had become unknowable. Varkal Mordain walked at their centre. He was broader than the others by a margin a mortal eye could not mistake. His left pauldron carried a shattered anvil device scored through with a hooked blade. A cloak of charred parchment strips hung from his backplate, each strip stamped with old imperial seals that had been cut apart and sewn together again. The weapon in his gauntlet was not drawn, but Severan knew it by reputation. The chain glaive called Grief Render had opened bastions and bodies alike. At his right stalked Harnal, blade-fingered, lord of the murderous arts. His gauntlets ended in long hooked talons of polished black metal, each blade engraved with tiny lines of devotional filth. He moved with a stillness that was somehow more unnerving than motion, as if murder had learned patience and put on armor. At Varkal's left came Bellicor, knife fighter of the slaughter cult, whose armor was thick with notches and impact scars. He had bound strips of flayed skin around one vambrace in lieu of prayer ribbons. In each fist he carried a fighting blade wider than a mortal's forearm. Severan had once watched him use them on a press-ganged mutineer. The memory returned to him now in wet pieces. Behind them limped Cordovax the warpsmith, mechadendrites flexing over his shoulders like iron scorpions. His harness dragged chains of tools, hooks, incision claws, and injector canisters. Half his face was gone. The metal that replaced it clicked when he breathed. Varkal mounted the iron dais above the strategium pit and looked out through the oculus at the shrine world turning beneath them. The hololithic globe of Basilica Mortis hung in sickly green light before him, tagged with defense stations, pilgrim lanes, orbital docks, shrine satellites, and traffic density streams so crowded they resembled capillary veins. When he spoke, his helm's vox cast each word through the chamber like a verdict struck from bronze. We were judged once, now we return the verdict. No one answered. The warband did not cheer. They were long beyond the need for theatrics among themselves. Severan saw only minute reactions, helm runes brightening, a gauntlet tightening on a weapon grip, the almost reverent stillness of men about to do what they had come to believe was holy. Cordovax broke the silence first. "The orbital docks stand rich," he said, voice grated through metal. "Prometheum reserves, press gangs, manufacturums spares, slaves enough to crew 3 captured hulls. Leave them intact. I will chain the world to our fleet." Varkal did not turn. No. Cordovax's mechadendrites twitched. Waste is not glory. Waste is hunger postponed. Terror endures longer than stores, Varkal said. Break the docks. Then we inherit rubble. We do not come to inherit. That ended it. Severan felt Cordovax's anger simmer through the command channel, a machine hiss of caged contempt, but he bowed his head by a degree. In this warband, obedience was never clean, but it was real enough to survive another hour. Harnal turned his helm towards Bellicor. "Try to leave some of the station population alive long enough to scream my name." Bellicor's reply was a low chuckle. Try not to paint the walls before I reach them. I know your habits, brother. You kill for applause. And you kill because language failed you in childhood. It still fails you now. Open a throat and speak into it. Harnal's talons flexed with a soft metal whisper, gladly. The fleet fired. Macro batteries rolled their first broadsides into the pilgrim lanes before the defense grid properly woke. Severin felt the deck buck beneath the judgment of iron as its forward batteries spat ruin. Through the oculus, he saw a cathedral transport simply come apart, its armoured flank folding inward beneath shell impacts before a blossom of internal fire vomited shrine relics, bodies, and metal into vacuum. Chapel ferries tried to bank away and died nose first, engine cones flaring madly as debris storms punched through their hulls. A pilgrim ark, vast as a city block and shaped like a reliquary casket, took a lance strike amidships and split open along its devotional spine. Thousands of bodies vented into the void in a silvering haze of ice crystals and blood. Severin heard the Vox traffic become madness. By the throne, we are under attack. Unidentified warships on all channels. Pilgrim Lane 14 is gone. Gone. There is no lane. Station command. Answer. Answer. Saint Basilius preserve us. That last plea drew a dry sound from Varkle. Not laughter. Something older and meaner. Basilius preserved nothing, he said. Boarding tubes clanged into place. Torpedo racks cycled. Deck runes flashed red. Harnal and Bellicor turned together and strode from the strategium without another word. Their kill squads followed, chosen, butchers, breachers, men who had once borne chapter discipline in their marrow and now wore only ruin with pride. Severin's feeds spliced into their tactical channels as part of his function. He did not have the option not to listen. He heard the launch rights, heard the torpedo lock cycle, heard the impact alarm shriek as adamantine cylinders punched through the skin of Basilica Mortis's ring stations. Then he saw through borrowed helm feeds. The boarding torpedo had rammed into a processional dock blister, its melter prow boring through chapel decks, cargo, braces, and pressure seals in one incandescent thrust. The inner hatch blasted inward. Smoke and sparks flooded the corridor. Harnal came through first. He moved in mag boots through a corridor gone half weightless, talons scissoring wide as autogun fire sparked from his chest plate. A voidsman in shrine militia colours rushed him with a boarding pike and died in 3 pieces. Harnal's blades cut through breastbone and gut with such force that the man's open torso spun away from his legs, his blood bursting out in crimson globes that drifted through the corridor like obscene fruit. Bellicor hit the deck a heartbeat later and charged low, fast, utterly direct. His first knife went through a priest's mouth and out the back of the skull. Teeth, tongue, and grey matter burst from the wound in a cloud that smeared across the bulkhead. His second blade took a militiaman beneath the ribs and ripped upward. The man's abdomen opened from groin to sternum. Intestines uncoiled into the thin gravity and floated in wet loops as he tried to hold himself together, with hands already becoming useless. Bolters barked behind them. Mass-reactive shells turned flesh into collapsing red sacks. A deacon in gold-stitched robes raised a relic pistol and had his arm blown off at the shoulder. The severed limb spun end over end, still clutching the weapon, while the deacon stumbled backward, spraying blood from the stump in pulsing beads that struck the lumen strips and drifted glowing in the station light. Someone screamed prayers. Someone screamed for bulkhead closure. Someone screamed with no words left. Bellicor drove forward through all of it. He caught a Voidmaster by the collar, smashed his helm faceplate against the wall until the visor caved inward. then drove both knives into the sides of his neck and sawed them around through gristle and spine. The head came loose only partially. It hung backward by strings of meat while the body kicked in place. Harnal took his time. That was the difference. Where Bellicor butchered for speed, Harnal curated death. He pinned a station officer to the vaulting with one claw through the jaw and opened him sternum to pelvis with the other. Organs billowed out in floating coils. Harnal stood inside that red bloom and Vox purred. Witness. The corridor became a charnel tube. Blood filmed the air. Teeth turned slowly in zero gravity. Fragments of skull clicked softly against the walls. One militia trooper lost both legs to chain blade teeth and spun in widening arcs, still alive, hands reaching for a lower body that was no longer his. A priest tried to swing a censer as a weapon. Bellicor caught the chain around his wrist, hauled the man forward, and drove a knee into his chest so hard that ribs burst through the back of the robe like ivory knives. Severin tore his eyes from the feed and swallowed bile. Below them, Basilica Mortis answered at last. Cardinal Marshal Oren Vale's voice flooded the worlds, public channels in sonorous command, magnified through Basilica towers and shrine vox masts. He spoke of endurance, of faith, of the Emperor's gaze upon his suffering flock. He named ancient martyrs and promised deliverance in the same breathless cadence with which lesser priests promised absolution to the dying. His words were rich, sonorous, and almost completely useless. Elsewhere on command frequencies, far from public hearing, Lord General Castor Drave was already doing the work that might keep fragments of the world alive a little longer. Severin heard clipped orders for hive levies, prison gangs, labour cohorts, and shrine militias. Rail stations were to be sealed. Hab block populations were to be sorted by fitness. Ammunition vaults were to be opened under military authority. Every Hab worker with hands enough to lift a laser gun was to be marked for conscription. The general did not waste breath on prayers. He wasted none on outrage either. He had recognized the thing, descending upon him. Extinction did not argue. It prepared. Severin thought the opening assault had reached its cruelty summit. Then the Deathmongers seized the world Vox. It happened with brutal simplicity. Cordovax's machine thralls burrowed through signal architecture while station command nodes were still dying. Ecclesiarchal frequencies shrieked with static. The cardinal's voice broke apart in a blizzard of machine howls. Then Varkal spoke to the entire world. His voice rolled from shrine towers, hab speakers, transport hubs, chapel bells, manufacturum tannoys, and command bunkers alike. It came to labourers frozen in assembly lines and to pilgrims kneeling in processional squares. It came to gun crews loading defence batteries and to children cowering beneath devotional icons. People of Basilica Mortis, hear the sons your Imperium judged and cast into damnation. Hear the condemned returned from the abyss. Your patron saints are liars. Your relics are carrion. Your prayers are air in the throats of corpses. Look to the void and know this. We have not come for your obedience. We have come for your ending. No chant answered him. No curse worthy of the scale. There was only the sound of a world beginning to understand. The first defense satellites died moments later. From the hive spires and processional plains below, men and boys and old penitents looked upward as bright points crossed the orbital dark. Some were the falling wrecks of pilgrim traffic. Some were the incandescent bones of ring stations cut open and venting fire. Some were defense platforms tumbling in pieces, their ammunition stores igniting one after another in silent blossoms. Then the true rain began as burning debris punched into the upper atmosphere and dragged tails of red-white flame behind it. Across Basilica Mortis, bells started ringing. Alarm klaxons, shrine gongs, cathedral peals, hab evacuation sirens. The whole world sounded like one vast temple having its throat cut. In the Vox pit, Severin Hale hung in his chains and watched the first fire descend from the heavens. He did not pray. He knew what kind of gods had come. The sky above Basilica Mortis did not merely darken. It rotted. What had begun as the sacred night of a shrine world, jeweled by orbital traffic and haloed by the soft devotional burn of pilgrim lanes, curdled into an iron bruise veined with fire. Wreckage rained from the upper dark in incandescent sheets. Cathedral barges came down as broken constellations, their reliquary hulls vomiting sparks and dead pilgrims by the thousand. Splintered defense satellites tore across the heavens in shrieking arcs, scattering molten fragments over hive roofs, mausoleum domes, and processional roads packed shoulder to shoulder with the faithful. Then the drop pods came. They did not descend with the machine exactitude of loyalist planetfall. These were murder coffins hurled from a damned fleet, their hulls wrapped in kill runes, old purity seals flayed and nailed back on in mockery, heat shields painted with filth and blood. They plunged through ash cloud and debris, wake like a meteor storm dispatched by a hate-drunk god. Some were true pods, black iron cylinders glowing white at the edges as they knifed down toward impact. Some were corrupted landers, broad-bellied and ugly, their flanks gnawed by warp corrosion, engines coughing furnace smoke and green witchfire. Others were not craft at all, but chunks of purposeful ruin. Dead station sections and gutted pilgrim hulls driven toward the world below, with guidance thrusters welded into their carcasses so that they might die as weapons. Basilica Mortis looked up, and death answered from the heavens in every shape known to war. Within the judgment of iron, Severin Hale hung over the Vox pit and drowned in the noise of a world coming apart. There was no longer any distinction between distress traffic and command speech. The channels had become one screaming sea. Civilian frequencies boiled with appeals for evacuation. Shrine bastions called for artillery support that did not yet exist. Transit wardens cried that their lower rails were already blocked with bodies. Hab prelates demanded military protection for relic precincts, while manufacturum overseers begged for troops to hold water pumps and generator shrines. Astropathic choirs burned themselves out, trying to hurl pleas into the void. Somewhere beneath it all ran the grinding undertone of shell impacts, structural failures, secondary detonations, and the endless machine shriek of overworked Vox arrays heating toward failure. Sevran's fingers danced over rune slates as he routed, filtered, tagged, discarded, and returned data according to standing kill priority. Casualty tallies were still preliminary and already impossible. The dead had climbed into the millions before the first wave of landings had even broken open. Whole traffic sectors had ceased transmission entirely. Vox. Requests flooded every channel faster than they could be catalogued. Men pleaded for ammunition, medici extraction, armored support, absolution, martyr rites, water, flame teams, anti-armor guns, orbital interdiction, and miracles. There were no miracles left in orbit. Above him, before the Strategium Oculus, Varkal Mordain watched the world receive his warband. Hololithic icons bloomed across the globe of Basilica Mortis, marking impact vectors and assault dispersal. Hive spires, manufacturum belts, mausoleum cities, processional planes, relay towers, lower transit nexus points, reservoir stations, generator cathedra, burial vault districts. The Lord of the Deathmongers had chosen not one spear thrust, but 100 wounds opened at once. No front line would stabilize. No defender would know where the true killing blow lay because there would be no single blow. There would only be saturation, ruin from every quarter, pressure without relief. Confirm all assault vectors, Varkal said. Sevran swallowed, tasted blood, and obeyed. All vectors confirmed, Lord. First wave striking the hive crowns and transit arteries now. Manufacturum quarter impact in less than a minute. Pilgrim planes receiving mass lander descent. Mausoleum districts under fire. Good. Varkal did not move. Let them defend everything. In defending everything, they will save nothing. Kordovac stood nearby amidst a nest of machine cables and twitching mechadendrites. His voice clicked from the augmetic ruin of his jaw. The Manufacturum Quarter contains forge reserves and promethium silos enough to sustain this fleet through the next campaign cycle. If your wish remains pure devastation, then at least allow me to seize the heavy assembly lines intact. Varkal turned his helm by the smallest degree. You mistake me again, Warpsmith. I mistake waste for strategy, Lord. You mistake punishment for conquest. The words came flat, cold, and without heat, which made them heavier than any roar. Kordovac held the gaze of the larger warlord for a stretched beat of silence before he dipped his head, though contempt still hissed from his vox grill. As you decree. Varkal looked back to the burning world. Loose your engines. Tear the manufacturums open. I want their foundries vomiting flame into the worker districts. I want their hab towers drowning in molten iron. Let the city choke on its own industry. Kordovac bowed with visible reluctance and voxed the machine cant of release. Deep in the lower launch decks, hell-forged gates opened. The first demon engines hit the Manufactorum Quarter with the force of artillery shells. Brass-limbed monstrosities crashed through shrine roof plating and conveyor gantries in avalanches of metal and dust. Defilers landed amidst loading yards and assembly plazas, their blade limbs punching through ferrocrete as battle cannons elevated and fired into packed labour districts. Mauler fiends tore through hab walls and transit pylons with blind, ecstatic ferocity, dragging themselves on piston limbs through streets jammed with fleeing workers. Forge fiends clamped onto collapsed refinery stacks and hosed autocannon fire into the crowds below until flesh, masonry, and rusted steel became one red paste sluicing into drainage channels. Kordovac descended with them inside a corrupted siege lander, and where his iron shadow passed, the city split wider. Demolisher charges were mag-locked to structural anchors. Magma cutters bored through coolant towers. Servitor crawlers infested substation shrines and reversed flow pressures until boilers ruptured. The Manufactorum Quarter did not fall cleanly. It blew outward in layers, flinging sheets of incandescent iron and burning promethium across the districts beyond it, so that civilian hab blocks and ration lines died for the crime of existing near industry. Below, on the ground, planetfall became an unbroken scream. Bellicor took the lower transit arteries exactly as Varkal had commanded, and in the way only Bellicor would have chosen. The lower arteries ran beneath the hive like the veins of a buried god. Freight tubes, mag-rail corridors, maintenance trunks, sump causeways, pilgrim access tunnels, and old service roads cut through bedrock and rusting support frames. They should have been evacuation channels. Lord General Drave had begun routing millions into them the moment the upper approaches became untenable. That made them perfect killing grounds. Bellicor's slaughter cult hit the tunnel mouths with chain blades revving and melters coughing white fire into pressure doors. Refugees had packed the arteries so tightly that movement had become a living crush. Bodies pressed to bodies, men carrying children, old labourers dragged by their sons, priests clutching reliquaries, prison levies still in shackles, workers with soot on their faces, and ration sacks on their backs. They had nowhere to run once the first blast doors failed. Bellicor led from the fore, knives in hand, his grey plate washed orange by warning lumens and muzzle flare. He did not bark encouragement. He did not sermonize. He simply killed and left the work to be understood by example. His first throws punched through the eyes of a pair of militia sergeants trying to form a firing rank. He vaulted the collapsing bodies and crashed into the crowd with the speed of something bred for butchery. One blade sheared through a shrine guard's collarbone and into the lungs. The other hacked down into a fleeing man's neck so deep that the head sagged sideways on a ragged tendon. Behind him came the cult, chain axes and cleavers rising and falling in cramped arcs, smashing skulls against tunnel walls, opening torsos so that coils of intestine poured out over the deck and were trampled beneath the panic of the living. There was no room for elegant battle in those arteries. The crush itself became a weapon. Men fell and could not rise. Children vanished under stamping feet. Shotgun blasts at arm's length blew faces apart into red grease. Someone loosed a flamer, and the backwash turned the tunnel into a screaming furnace as burning promethium rolled over skin, cloth, and flesh alike. Those who tried to crawl over the dead found the corpses slick and treacherous beneath them. Those who turned to fight could not lift their weapons properly in the press. Those who surrendered died with hands raised. Bellicor fought through all of it, laughing through his vox grill, not with joy, but with the raw animal exultation of a man finally returned to the only liturgy he believed. He planted his boot on the chest of a fallen enforcer and drove both knives down through the man's face until bone cracked under the pressure. He seized another by the jaw and split the mouth wider with a wrenching twist, teeth and blood showering his vambrace. The dead piled knee-deep. The living tripped over torn limbs, over pulped faces, over slick lengths of bowel and strips of skin. The lower arteries became abattoirs fed by the weight of their own congestion. Elsewhere, far above the lower dark, Harnal entered the upper processional districts. The processional roads of Basilica Mortis had been built for glory. They were avenues broad enough for relic parades and military triumphs, lined by saint statuary, braziers, incense towers, hanging censers, shrines set into every alcove, and archways of carved stone displaying the victories of imperial faith over darkness. Pilgrims once crawled those roads on bleeding knees, in the hope of glimpsing a holy vault before death claimed them. Now they served as Harnal's gallery. He advanced with his chosen through plazas veiled in incense and ash, his blade fingers twitching as if the city itself excited him. Where resistance hardened, he broke it. Where command posts held, he made examples. Officers captured alive were not merely killed. They were opened. Militia captains were skinned down to the muscle and hung from shrine arches by meat hooks punched through the clavicle. Priests were strung upside down from saintly statuary, their throats cut shallow enough that they died slowly, painting the marble in arterial curtains. A defense prefect was pinned, spread-armed against the bronze image of Saint Basilius, and had every rib split and folded outward like the petals of a red flower. Harnal left them all suspended where the crowds might see. His Vox transmission rode stolen public channels for a time, purring into every district touched by his work. "Behold your guardians," he said, as picked feeds crawled with images of swaying carcasses and torn uniforms. "Behold the strength of your faith. It hangs light in the wind." He meant to horrify, and he did. He meant to profane, and he did that too. Yet there was method beneath the spectacle. Every square that saw his work lost cohesion faster. Every unit ordered to retake those avenues found its men firing high, hands shaking, courage rotting in the face of what awaited capture. On the surface, command levels beneath the Basilica of the final judge, Lord General Castor Drave fought like a man trying to save pieces from a board already aflame. He was no fool. He did not demand impossible heroics. He ordered depth, overlap, attrition, and delay. Heavy weapon nests were to be staggered in tiers through transit plazas and stairwell mouths. Armor reserve companies were to wait in recessed avenues and counterstrike only when the enemy committed. Artillery batteries were to register fallback lines in advance and be prepared to shell their own abandoned positions the instant the line gave way. Hab districts with no defensive value were to be stripped of manpower. Water and food depots were to be fortified. Medici stations were to withdraw behind the second curtain line. He spoke not of victory, because victory had already become an obscenity, but of duration, of bleeding the invader for every meter, of keeping enough structure intact that some fraction of the population might live through the week. He might have done more, had Cardinal Marshal Oren Vale not stood above him in authority where symbolism was concerned. Vale's commands came cloaked in prayer and poisoned by sanctimony. Relic precincts were to be held at all cost. St. Vaults were never to be abandoned. Processional squares of ceremonial significance were to remain garrisoned even when they served no military purpose. Companies already assigned to reinforce water recyclers or ammunition depots were pulled away and sent to die around ossuaries and martyr shrines, because, in the cardinal's judgment, no true servant of the throne could concede holy ground. Drave's face, on Severin's stolen command pict, had gone grey with a contained rage beyond exhaustion. "My Lord Cardinal," he said through clenched discipline, "if I commit 3 more regiments to the Vault of 7 Martyrs, then the East Lower Habs lose their anti-armor screen. The vault will not be abandoned. The vault has no strategic relevance. It has sanctity. It has stone walls and old bones. It has meaning." Drave leaned over the hololith, one hand planted hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Around him, staff officers moved like ghosts through a bunker already shaking from distant impacts. "Meaning does not stop chain blades." Vale's answer came without hesitation. "Faith does." Severin almost laughed when he heard it, not because it was amusing, but because absurdity and horror had become difficult to tell apart. The hours bled onward. Casualty figures rose so quickly that the machine spirits handling the tallies lagged behind reality. Millions dead, millions more displaced. Entire processional wards blacked out under debris storms. Rail corridors cut. Water reserves contaminated. Defense requests multiplying beyond any sane capacity to answer them. The dead were already being ground into the roads beneath armor columns, reduced to slick red mud under the tracks of Lehman Russ tanks and the iron feet of retreating mobs. The city swallowed blood until the drains clogged and began spitting it back. Severin routed another surge of channels and suddenly found a live feed marked priority by Bellicor's personal sigil. The pict wavered, blurred with movement, then steadied on the ruined interior of a lower command station somewhere inside the transit arteries. Bodies lay everywhere, some in imperial uniform, some in worker rags, some hacked so badly that clothing was the only means of distinction left to them. At the center of the frame knelt an imperial colonel, his face pulped on one side, one eye swollen shut, dress coat turned black with blood. Bellicor stood behind him. One knife lay gently across the man's throat. "Speak," Bellicor said. The colonel's lips trembled. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of an officer, but of an exhausted old man whose world had died around him. To all surviving defenders in the lower sectors, lay down your arms, by command authority of the... He coughed blood and tried again. By command authority of sector defense, cease resistance. You cannot hold. Surrender, and... Bellicourt dug the edge in just enough to bead red. And perhaps mercy will... Bellicourt laughed once and drew the blade across. The colonel's throat opened from ear to ear. Blood fountained over his chest in a hot arterial sheet. He clutched at the wound with both hands, fingers slipping at once in the torrent, trying to hold his life inside his neck, while wet choking sounds bubbled out around the ruin of his windpipe. Bellicourt did not cut the transmission. He stood behind the dying officer and watched him drown in his own blood on live vox, letting every listening command post and every huddled refuge tunnel hear the gargling, collapse of false hope. When the body finally toppled forward, Bellicourt bent close to the pickup. "There is your mercy," he said. By then the first hive wall was dying. The outer curtain of Hive Mortis Primus had stood for centuries, a monumental ring of ferrocrete, bastion towers, macro gun nests, and armoured gates large enough to admit pilgrim columns by the 100,000. It had weathered revolt, famine, and Xenos raid. It had not been built for the kind of war descending upon it now. Cordovax's engines broke its foundations while siege fire hammered the parapets from without. Demolition charges nested in old maintenance culverts. Defilers walked rounds into the tower roots until cracks spidered through the mass. Captured munition haulers were driven against the inner bulwarks and detonated. The wall did not simply shatter outward beneath assault. It sagged, groaned, split, and then folded inward, sections of it toppling into the hive approaches in avalanches of dust, shattered masonry, mangled guns, and crushed defenders. The impact rolled through the district like the footfall of a god. Varkle was already there when the breach became final. He advanced through shell bursts and falling debris, as if neither flame nor fragmentation had the authority to deny him passage. His chosen moved around him in brutal lockstep, bolters firing into the smoke, chain blades snarling. Dead militia and shrine guards lay strewn at his feet, their blood making dark rivulets through the powdered stone. Beyond the breach, the hive interior yawned open, tier upon tier of streets, habstacks, transit bridges, shrine plazas, and panicked millions. A shell burst close enough to drench his armor in dust and gobbets of human meat. He did not so much as turn his helm. Sevran heard him over the command channel, calm as judgment. "This is not conquest." He stepped over the severed half of a guardsman and into the settling ruin of the wall. Conquest leaves something standing. By the third day of slaughter, Basilica Mortis had ceased to die as a city and begun to die as a body. The first wounds had been obvious. Orbital stations gutted, hive walls broken inward, processional districts turned into butcher yards, transit arteries made red and lightless under the press of the dead. Those were the great visible blows, the strikes that shattered morale and flooded the Vox with panic. But Varkle Mordaena had not come for panic alone. Panic passed. Terror exhausted itself. Men adapted to thunder, to fire, to the sight of corpses in heaps. What they did not endure, what broke a world at the root, was the murder of its functions. So the Deathmongers ceased merely killing men and began killing survival. Corpse starch plants burned first. The rendering complexes of Basilica Mortis had always stood at the edge of doctrinal shame, hidden behind liturgical language and official necessity. There, the dead of the hive were fed to grinders, separators, heat baths, and chemical mills, broken down into paste and slurry to sustain the living poor. It was a vile economy, and an old one, as imperial as prayer and ration books. When Cordavax's engines broke through the outer yards and Harnal's chosen sealed the worker gates, the plants became crematoria of another order. Processing vats ruptured, protein silos caught fire, conveyor lines carrying the dead became belts of burning flesh. Workers who fled were shot in their aprons. Workers who hid inside the grind halls were sealed in and cooked with the rendered stock. The flames rose greasy and black, and by dusk the ash falling over the adjacent habs tasted of burnt fat and cooked bone. Medici bastions died next. The enemy did not merely bombard the hospitals. They took their time where the wounding was gathered. Bellicor's knife fighters hit emergency triage lines at shift change, when the corridors were packed with stretcher teams, limbless wounded, surgeons black, to the elbow with blood, and confessors trying to push the dying through last rites before the next wave arrived. There was no honour in such war, but honour had long ago been buried with cleaner ages. The Deathmongers hacked through Medici screens and slaughtered the helpless where they lay. Fluorescent surgery wards became slick red abattoirs. Recovery cots were overturned. Rebreather tubes were cut. Astartes chain blades screamed through cowering orderlies and still sedated troopers. A surgeon was found later nailed to the operating theatre wall by his own bone saws, chest peeled open, his organs arranged on metal trays around him with the precision of ritual. Water recyclers followed. Pumps were sabotaged. Filtration shrines blown. Settling cisterns poisoned with corpses. Promethium runoff and industrial waste from the manufacturum quarter. One recycler station in the East Lower Hive tried to hold out under a battalion's protection. Cordavax sent a mauler fiend through its foundation and watched the central pressure tanks crack. The station burst apart in a white torrent so violent it sheared men from parapets and drove ferrocrete slabs the size of troop carriers down flooded access ways. For almost an hour, survivors were heard over the Vox begging for extraction as they drowned in water turned brown with mud, blood, sewage, and the floating limbs of their comrades. Refugee concentrations came last because by then they were easy. The masses that had fled the burning outer wards and broken processional roads had no place to go but inward, downward, and together. They packed hab concourses, rail yards, shrine squares, cargo depots, burial forecourts, and food distribution lines by the 100,000. Once the Deathmongers identified where the world's fear had pooled, they shelled those concentrations without hesitation. Heavy bolter fire chewed through knots of humanity so tightly pressed that each round passed through 3 and 4 bodies before it spent itself. Mortars walked the edges of encampments, driving the crowds inward until the crush killed almost as many as the shrapnel. Then came the armor columns and demon engines, grinding over the fallen and the living alike until the streets ran with that thick industrial red slurry that had become the true colour of Basilica Mortis. In the lower command vaults beneath the Basilica of the Final Judge, Lord General Castor Drave stared at the hololithic spread of the world and understood, with a clarity that felt colder than fear, that he was no longer fighting for victory. He was fighting over the manner of death. The reports fed into his command throne from every surviving district, and he read them not as separate disasters but as a pattern. Food systems destroyed, water systems collapsing, Medici capacity obliterated, fuel reserves detonated or seized, transit arteries rendered unusable by corpses, cave-ins, or enemy interdiction. The Deathmongers were not merely taking territory. They were excising the organs by which a hive sustained itself, even if he held the Basilica, even if the relief forces he had begged from the subsector command arrived in strength, even if some miracle broke the invaders' will and drove them back into the void. The world would still die. Billions would live long enough only to starve, sicken, riot, or drink poison in the rubble of their own shrines. One of his adjutants, a young major whose cheeks had hollowed over 2 sleepless days, laid a fresh data slate at his elbow. Updated ration projections, Lord General. Drave read the first lines and let the slate drop from his hand. How long? The major swallowed. If current destruction rates continue, and if the lower recyclers remain offline, then survivable distribution collapses in less than 11 days across the central hives. The outer districts are already... I did not ask about the outer districts. No, Lord General. Drave looked back to the map. Whole sectors pulsed crimson. His guns still fired. His reserve companies still counterattacked. His artillery still found targets and made them pay. Yet it had all become secondary to the true war, and he had seen it too late. They are murdering the future, he said. No one answered him. There was nothing to say. Far below the hive proper, beneath the transit lines that Bellicor had already made infamous, another war raged in the underworks. The corpse vats and sump ways beneath Basilica Mortis were a second city, one never shown on pilgrimage maps. Waste pumps throbbed there. Processing tunnels stretched for kilometers. Loading caverns opened like underground cathedra around cranes and rail slings, meant to haul rendered stock, fuel drums, mortuary slabs, and labor quotas. Sump rivers crawled black and sluggish through trenches cut into old stone, carrying chemical runoff, liquefied filth, and whatever else the upper city flushed down in the hope of forgetting it existed. Bellicor loved it. The lower dark suited his kind of war. There was no room for broad firing ranks or clean armor advance. No space for banners, speeches, or formal bravery. Only blind corners, half-light, steam bursts, slippery iron, and the wet breath of men packed into tunnels too tight to raise a rifle without striking the wall. He led his knife fighters through that underworld with the surety of a beast returning to its burrow. A squad of shrine militia tried to make a stand behind stacked corpse caskets in a loading cavern near Mortuary Gate 9. Their sergeant had good instincts. He kept the men low, used the caskets as cover, and waited until the first grey armour appeared through the steam before ordering fire. Las bolts flashed red through the dark. 3 struck Bellicor. 1 glanced from his pauldron. 1 burst harmlessly across his breastplate. 1 hit the eye lens of his helm and left only a crazed scorch line. Then he was among them. He came over the caskets like a thrown axe, knives low, body tucked, all brutal speed. The sergeant got his bayonet up. Bellicor caught the rifle with one hand, wrenched it aside, and buried a blade through the man's cheek into the back of the skull. He tore the knife free with a wet crack and drove his elbow into the next defender's throat, hard enough to collapse the larynx. The man staggered backward, making a hideous whistling noise, hands at his neck, and Bellicor split him from clavicle to sternum before he hit the ground. His cult came behind him in a wave of chain teeth and crude devotion. A guardsman lost both hands at the wrists and stared stupidly at the blood pumping from the white knobs of bone before a boot sent him into the sump trench. Another was dragged bodily over the caskets and disemboweled on their sharp corners while still alive, his guts spilling down the metal cases that held the processed dead. the loading cavern filled with the shriek of ricochets, the clatter of knives, the bellow of chain axes, and the thick choking cries of men dying too close together. Bellicor fought as if the tunnel walls themselves offended him. He slammed one defender face first into a support strut until the skull broke and the face became a red cave. He kicked another into the open sump and pinned him there with a knife through the jaw, while the black water dragged at the body. He laughed when blood mixed with the chemical sludge and sent pink froth skittering across the surface. In the cramped arteries, the corpses became obstacles. Men slipped on severed fingers. Bayonets caught in ribs. A fleeing trooper turned a corner at full speed and found only Bellicor's blade waiting for him. The knife entered under the chin and came out through the crown, lifting him onto his toes before the body slid free. The underworks rang with the scrape of armor on stone and the ugly animal sounds of close murder. Above, where there was room for spectacle, Harnal made murder into liturgy. He selected plazas, overpasses, shrine courts, and command approaches not merely for tactical utility, but for their visibility. The veteran guardsmen of Basilica Mortis had seen horror already. They had watched walls fall and refugee columns burn. They had fought amid raining debris and knelt in trenches filling with blood. Even so, Harnal found ways to break them. At the Plaza of Penitent Triumph, he arranged 100 corpses around the steps of a shattered saint monument. Officers in the innermost ring flayed to the muscle and posed upright on iron rods. Priests in the second ring, bellies opened, their intestines wound around their throats like rosaries. Militia captains in the outermost ring, kneeling headless, hands clasped in false prayer, while their severed heads had been set on the steps facing inward toward the saint they had failed. Harnal had each eye cavity filled with burning incense wax, so that the whole arrangement smoked and wept in the dusk, like some blasphemous icon of judgment. At another crossing, he suspended a field command staff from the underside of a transit bridge with hooks driven through spine and sternum. Their bodies swayed above the avenue, while picked projectors taken from propaganda shrines cast devotional light upward across the opened meat of them. On a surviving public channel, he allowed a few moments of silence so that the defenders could simply stare. Veteran troopers broke then. Not all, not even most, but enough. Enough that firing lines wavered. Enough that men looked behind them more often than ahead. Enough that whole platoons requested transfer from districts Harnal was known to haunt. Fear no longer came only from dying. It came from being witnessed in death and made into message. Within the Deathmongers' own lines, the poison of discontent thickened. Cordovax had grown open in his contempt. The holds of the fleet were filling, but not with the order of victory. Ammunition depletion, reports rose with every exchange. Wounded Astartes lay upon iron pallets in medici bays never meant for such numbers. Their black blood drained into brass basins. Their armor cut apart so damaged plate might be replaced with whatever scavenged ceramite could be hammered to fit. Prisoners screamed in chain pens awaiting interrogation, execution, or worse. Scrap taken from manufacturums and dock wreckage piled in sorted mountains for refit. Fuel was being hoarded. Boarding losses mounted. Every gain was bought in depletion. Severan saw it all as he moved between vox pits, cargo galleries, and casualty decks in chains and exhaustion. He had once imagined the Deathmongers as limitless simply because they did not care. Now he saw the truth of war. Carelessness did not make a force infinite. It merely spent lives faster. The warband bled. It ran low. It scavenged. It reused the dead. He passed a chamber where 3 wounded Astartes lay on iron cradles while armor thralls worked over them with cutters and bone saws. One had lost an arm at the shoulder and stared at the ceiling without speech, while a replacement interface was drilled into the remaining flesh. Another had half his helm fused into his face and had to be held down by chains while the plate was peeled away. A third, his abdomen opened to reveal black slick coils of transhuman viscera, still muttered kill oaths between clenched teeth as servo claws stitched him shut. Nearby, mortal prisoners knelt in rows, stripped to the waist, skin marked for sorting. Slave, ration, interrogation, sport. The marks were made in grease pencil or blood according to who held the brush. Cordovax found Severin there and did not bother hiding his scorn. "Look well, little thrall," the warpsmith said, gesturing with a mechadendrite toward the overflowing bays. "This is the cost of your lord's purity. We could have chained this world to our will. We could have made dockyards of its orbit and magazines of its hive, depths. Instead, we burn food, poison water, and trade gene sons for spectacle." Severin bowed his head. He knew better than to answer. Cordovax voxed for the strategium and repeated the sentiment in harsher form before the warband's inner circle. Varkul listened without motion. "We could win this world," Cordovax said. "Not merely break it. Hold it. Use it. Make it a fortress." Only then did Varkul rise from the command throne. He descended the dais one slow step at a time, armor heavy with dried blood and soot, until he stood almost face to face with the warpsmith. The strategium dimmed around them. Harnal watched from the shadows near the oculus. Bellicor stood to one side, still wet from underwork slaughter, his knives crusted dark. "Fortresses," Varkul said, "are for men who plan to live." The silence after the words was heavier than a bombardment. It might have ended there, had another chosen not mistaken tension for opportunity. The challenger was Corvain Thule, a champion of the old warband stock, broad as a bulkhead and proud of the slaughter tally etched into his armor. He stepped forward with the swagger of a man who had survived too many campaigns to believe death would choose him today. "Then perhaps," Thule said, "we require a lord who plans further than a grave." It was a grave error, yet for the space of a breath it hung in the strategium as if the whole warband leaned toward it. Varkul did not draw. He did not speak. Harnal moved. One moment he was at the edge of the chamber, his blade fingers hanging still. The next, he was in front of Thule, close enough that the larger champion had not even brought his weapon up before the talons struck. The first cut went through the throat. The second punched under the jaw and out through the crown. Harnal wrenched sideways with both arms. Thule's head came off in a spray so violent it sheeted the nearby hololith with red. The body stood for an impossible heartbeat, pumping blood from the neck in hot bursts, then crashed to the deck. Harnal let the severed head tumble from his claws and said very softly, "Unity is not a debate." No one challenged Varkul after that. Fear held the warband together as firmly as hate. On the surface, Commissar Hest Varro was waging his own private crusade inside the Imperial lines. The enemy outside the walls was visible. The enemy within was rot, desertion, hysteria, pilgrim mobs clogging fire lanes, shrine militias abandoning posts to defend relic niches, guardsmen breaking when Harnal's work appeared in the smoke ahead, men stealing water from field hospitals, officers falsifying troop numbers to hide that companies had dissolved in the night. Varro answered all of it with the old language of the commissariat. He shot the first captain in front of his own company for retreating without order. He shot 3 deserters beside a waterline while the crowd watched and then had their bodies left. standing on poles with placards naming them faithless. He walked into a trench where soldiers had begun chanting prayers instead of loading their rifles, and put a bolt round through the preacher leading them before barking, "The Emperor has no use for your noise. Fire!" His methods were merciless, but they worked where nobler means would have failed. Units steadied under the fear of immediate death. Lines held a little longer. Men reformed. The second war, the inward one against collapse, did not cease, but it was checked. For a few precious hours, the defenders remembered that terror could be directed outward as well as inward. Then came the surrender corridor. The Deathmongers opened it deliberately, broadcasting on stolen channels that civilians and withdrawing defenders might pass unmolested along a designated artery between the lower shrine wards and the central hab approaches. The route was wide, lit, and temporarily free of shelling. It looked like mercy. It looked like the first flaw in the invaders' cruelty. So they came. Tens of thousands at first. Then more. Civilians dragging carts. Medici teams with the wounded. Retreating soldiers with bandaged heads and empty charge packs. Priests carrying reliquary boxes. Labour gangs pushing children on loading trolleys. The columns stretched farther than the eye could follow, compacted by fear into one great moving knot of desperate flesh. The first shells landed when the corridor was full. Artillery struck the front and rear almost simultaneously, trapping the mass in the middle. Heavy bolters opened from concealed galleries above. Reaper autocannons scythed the edges. Mortars walked the center line in savage, deliberate increments. The crowd convulsed inward. Those who fell vanished beneath the stampede. Those who tried to climb the walls were shredded by gunfire. Then armor hit from both flanks, chaos vehicles and panicked Imperial transports alike slamming into the packed bodies, crushing men, women, children, wounded, and soldiers into the ferrocrete in a slick red carpet that no one could stop crossing. From above, Harnal's chosen cast hooked chains down into the press and dragged screaming victims upward into the firelight. Bellicor's killers entered at the rear and turned the trapped withdrawal into handslaughter, hacking at backs, severing hamstrings, opening throats of those already pinned by the weight of the dying. The killing went on for nearly an hour. By the end, the corridor was impassable except over the piled dead. When the last of the screams ebbed into gunsmoke and crackling fire, even the hardened officers in Drave's command vault understood what kind of war they faced. It was not enough to win against such an enemy. One had to prevent him from existing at all. Night fell again over Basilica Mortis, though the city no longer understood night as darkness. The whole horizon burned. Ash drifted like black snow. The roads of the shrine world had become slaughter roads, and every district fed them. Then, in the long-range auger chambers beneath the basilica, a junior adept began to shout. At first, none listened. Too many alarms had cried wolf in these past days. Too many sensor ghosts had risen from debris fields, exploding stations, and atmospheric storms. But the adept kept shouting, voice cracking, calling for confirmation, for senior review, for astropathic cross-check. Data streamed in from outer pickets, heat blooms, drive signatures, vector harmonics, a formation, not wreckage, not raiders, not another wave of the damned, Imperial ships. The word passed through the vaults like a pulse through a dying heart. Officers turned from their stations. Vox clerks stopped speaking mid-sentence. Men who had forgotten what hope felt like looked up as if they had heard the Emperor himself inhale. Lord General Drave crossed the chamber in 3 strides and leaned over the hololithic display as fresh runes lit in the outer dark. "Confirm," he said. Adept hands trembled over the console. Multiple hulls, Lord General. Imperial pattern drive signatures. Long range still uncertain on class and number, but confirmed friendly code architecture within the transmission ghosts. Relief force inbound. For the first time in days, the bunker did not seem like a tomb. Around the chamber, men straightened. Some made the sign of the Aquila. Some laughed in the stunned, broken way of men who had expected to die unseen. Somewhere deeper in the command levels, the news spread and was repeated, each retelling larger, cleaner, holier than the raw data justified. A battle group, a crusade spearhead, angels of death, deliverance, salvation. Drave did not speak the word. He knew better than that, yet even he felt the weight in his chest shift by a fraction. Above them, the shrine world still burned. Below them, the dead still clogged the tunnels, and the water still ran foul. But in the outer dark, beyond the ring of wreckage and ash, help was coming. And for the first time since the grey ships had split the holy night, Basilica Mortis dared to believe it might not die alone. When the first reports of the relief force reached the judgment of iron, Varkal Mordain did not rage. He did not tear down hololiths, nor call for panic acceleration, nor gather his captains to drown uncertainty in boasts. He simply turned from the strategium oculus, while Basilica Mortis burned below him, and withdrew into the silence of his command sanctum. The chamber had once been a reliquary chapel aboard a loyalist strike cruiser. Some trace of that original sanctity remained beneath the defilement. The vaulting was still severe and high. Broken saints still knelt in niches cut into the walls, though their faces had been hammered flat and their hands replaced with iron hooks or blade lengths. Candle racks guttered beneath black smoke. Armor fragments hung on chains from the ceiling, old grey plates bearing the broken anvil sigil of another life. A warrior who entered that place could not avoid the truth of what had been and what remained. Severin Hale was summoned there in chains. He came alone, guided by mute thralls through a succession of blast doors and incense-thick passageways until he stood at the edge of the sanctum floor. Varkal waited before a rack of ancient helms. Some were cracked, some had been melted and reforged. One still bore a purity seal, browned almost black with age. The warlord's own helm rested beneath his arm. Without it, his face seemed more brutal, not less. The scars ran deep through pale old flesh. One cheek had been replaced by augmetic plate. His eyes were hard, exhausted, and far older than a mortal span had any right to recognize. Outside, through thick armored glass set into the far wall, the void burned with distant weapons fire. The relief force had entered the outer system. The first long-range exchanges had begun. Pilgrim hulks drifted as black, silhouettes against lance flare. Wreckage spun in slow, silent ruin. "You hear more than most men hear," Varkal said. Severin bowed his head. "As you command, Lord. You hear fear in its first breath, despair in its first tremor, hope in its first lie." Varkal set his helm on the altar stone that had once held a saint's bones. "Tell me what the world below believes." Severin answered carefully. "It believes rescue has come. It believes it may endure." Varkal gave a sound that might once have been amusement. Endure. That was our word too. He moved to the glass and looked out into the black. For a time he said nothing. Severin remained kneeling, every instinct urging silence, yet sensing that the summons had not been for mere information. It had been for witness. At last Varkal spoke, and his voice had changed. It was no longer the command bark of the warlord. It was lower, rougher, cut open by memory. "We did not enter the Eye as traitors. Remember that, thrall. Whatever names the corpse empire spits upon us now, we went in loyal. The chamber dimmed around his words. The fire beyond the glass became another fire in another age. We were the brothers of the anvil then, grey helms, clean litanies, discipline wrought into us until it was marrow. When the judgment was passed and the chapters of the condemned were ordered into the abyss, we obeyed. We did not howl. We did not mutiny. We did not curse the throne that cast us away. We made ready. We armed. We boarded. We knelt before chaplains and swore to carry the Emperor's wrath into hell itself. His lip curled faintly at the memory. We thought obedience would sanctify the sentence. Severan listened while the silence of the sanctum filled with older ghosts. Varkul spoke of the Abyssal Crusade not as an epic, but as a procession of slow dismemberments. Chapters cast into the eye as if righteousness alone could make madness measurable. Fleet masters, praying over maps that changed while they looked at them. Warp routes that bled ships away in screaming pieces. Astropaths burning from the inside out. Entire boarding companies lost in corridors that opened into other vessels, other centuries, other hungers. Worlds that had once been names on tactical charts becoming shrines of ruin. Demon nests, grave empires, and impossible geometries where loyal men killed loyal men because truth itself had grown teeth. We marched deeper because that was the order, he said. We fought because that was what we were made to do. We believed there was meaning in persistence, that every brother lost was coin paid towards some final accounting the Imperium would understand. He turned and looked at Severan with those old, dead eyes. The Imperium never intended to understand. It intended us to vanish. The name Belial IV passed from his mouth like a curse he had spent centuries chewing. He described the Crone world not as a place, but as a wound in reality. Pale ruins rising from dead plains, towers with no right angles and no reverence for human proportion, black crystal half buried in ash, echoes in the air that were not sound, but memory made atmosphere. The Brothers of the Anvil had landed there under orders, purging old Xenos ruins for signs of enemy concentrations and relic traffic. They had expected resistance. They had not expected capture. The raiders came in silence and knives, Varkul said. Not warriors of honor. Hunters. Scalpel murderers. Drukhari filth. They took us alive where they could. Those they could not take. They flensed for sport and left where we would find them. His jaw tightened. For the first time, Severan understood that beneath the immense weight of the warlord's composure, there remained something raw, something never cauterized. We were put in cages, not cells. Cages, suspended things of wire and pain, where a brother could not stand fully nor kneel cleanly. Armor stripped. Gene flesh studied. Chaplains open to hear whether faith had a different sound from ordinary screaming. Apothecaries blinded and made to identify organs by touch while their own were taken from them in pieces. The candlelight seemed to shiver. Varkul did not embellish. He did not need to. The restraint of the telling made it worse. He spoke of surgical theatres where Astartes were cut down to inspect how much punishment a transhuman body could survive before the soul broke. Of starvation precise enough to preserve muscle while hollowing thought. Of humiliation layered upon agony until loyalty itself became a thing associated with chains and laughter. He spoke of brothers dragged into arenas to kill mortals for scraps. Of captains forced to watch neophytes die slowly and know that there was no tactical lesson, no honorable exchange, no purpose but amusement. Of names forgotten because pain had replaced them. Of liturgies recited at first in defiance, then in routine, then in mockery, then not at all, We did not become what we are in a single revelation, he said. No god appeared to us with a bargain. No whisper tempted us with power. Duty was not corrupted. Duty was skinned alive, starved, mocked, and taught its own impotence until hatred was all that remained strong enough to stand upright.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
He looked again to the void. When we escaped, we did not return to real space with a cause. We returned with an appetite. We found an imperial outpost first. We might have gone to them. We might have pleaded the truth. We might have sought absolution. He was silent for a heartbeat. We killed every living thing on that station before anyone could speak. That was the first honest act of our new life. Severin found that he could not look away. Varkul's voice deepened once more into iron certainty. Now you understand. I do not believe in victory as the Imperium understands it. Banners raised, worlds held, populations tithed, fortresses garrisoned. That is the thinking of men who still imagine tomorrow belongs to them. We were cured of that disease on Belial 4. What do you believe in, Lord? Severin asked, before fear could stop him. Varkul answered at once. Mutilation. The words settled over the sanctum like a blade laid on an altar. The enemy's body, the enemy's memory, the enemy's future. That is war, not occupation, not governance. If a world survives you, then you have not spoken clearly enough. The command rooms along the walls flashed amber, a summons from the strategium. The relief force had closed distance. Calculations were changing by the minute. Varkul took up his helm again. When he spoke now, it was as the lord of the Deathmongers. They are not strong enough to save the planet, but they are strong enough to steal survivors from me. He sealed the helm onto his scarred face and became more machine, more execution than man. That will not be permitted. The strategium was alive when he returned. Hololithic space reeled above the command dais. Basilica Mortis turned below, wreathed in the embers of orbital ruin. Beyond it, new icons advanced into system formation. The relief force was no grand crusade. Even Severin could see that at a glance. Enough hulls to matter, not enough to dominate. A hard thrust of imperial steel aimed at the wounded heart of the war. Escorts, cruisers, a carrier element, troop transports guarded tightly. If they broke through to low orbit, they could flood the upper lanes with evacuation traffic, reinforce the defense grid, and perhaps extract millions before the Deathmongers completed the work. Cordovax studied the display with visible calculation. We can still withdraw with strength intact and leave the carrion world to choke on what we have already done. No, said Varkul. Harnell's helm inclined. Bellicor made a low sound of approval that was almost a growl. Varkul began, issuing orders with cold precision. The burning pilgrim hulks still drifting in the inner lanes were to be repurposed as moving mines. Thruster servitors were to weld themselves to their broken flanks and drive them into the enemy's approach paths. Debris fields around the ruined ring stations were to be seeded with melter charges and void mines. Sacrificial escorts from the ragged edges of the Deathmonger fleet were to take the forward line, not to survive, but to force the relief force to scatter its opening volleys and lose formation purity. Engine-crippled transports would be lit with false signal beacons to mimic Medici hulks and bait rescue craft into kill pockets. Nothing intact was to be left where the enemy might capture and use it. Cordovax's voice roughened. That includes dock wrecks with recoverable promethium, ammunition lighters, half-functional defense arrays, all of it. All of it, Varkul said. The warpsmith spread his mechadendrites in bitter disbelief. We could have stripped those assets after the engagement. The enemy must inherit only wreckage. A pause. Then Cordovax bowed his head with a hatred so naked it was almost pure. As decreed. The void ambush began before the relief force completed its inward burn. Kilometers-long warships turned the darkness into murder geometry. Macro cannon broadsides crossed the inner system like the wrath of dead cities. Shells the size of shrine towers punching through armor belts and detonating in decks packed with men, munitions, and sacred machinery. Lances carved incandescent wounds through the black, spearing one vessel from prow to stern until atmosphere, bodies, and altar debris erupted from the exit points in a white-blue torrent. Burning pilgrim hulks, driven by crude thrusters and remote machine spite, drifted suddenly into the relief formation and burst apart under point defense fire, each one vomiting shrapnel, fuel fire, and hidden mines into the paths of escorts trying to screen their larger brethren. Sevran drowned in the vox of it. Damage calls, gunnery prayers, collision alarms, void suit breaches by the thousand, men screaming for compartment seals, men screaming because the seals had already closed with their legs on the wrong side, tech priests chanting reactor catechisms over decks flooded in flame, naval officers trying to maintain bearing discipline while dead station pieces the size of cathedrals spun through their firing arcs. One cruiser of the relief force took a pilgrim hulk amidships and vanished behind a bloom of fire so large it briefly outshone the world below. When the glare died, the vessel was still moving, but wrong. Its whole centerline had been opened. Atmosphere and wreckage trailed from it in a glittering stream, and bodies were spilling from the wound by the tens of thousands. A Deathmonger escort, little more than an armoured knife wrapped around engines, rammed an Imperial frigate under full burn. The collision tore both ships almost in half. Their wrecks spun locked together, while secondary explosions chased each other along the joined hulls like beads of orange prayer flame. Cordovax destroyed everything he had argued to preserve. Mag-locked fuel hulks were detonated beneath advancing escorts. Salvage platforms were scuttled into debris clouds. Partially functional station arrays were overloaded and blown apart rather than left to be boarded. Sevran saw the warpsmith's orders pass through the noosphere like clenched teeth. Every asset ruined by his own hand made the bitterness in his machine voice sharper. Above the world, atmosphere peeled away from shattered orbital structures and burned in pale sheets. The void itself seemed crowded with fire. Tens of thousands died every minute, and still the battle only deepened. On the surface, Drave saw enough through the command feeds to understand that the relief force had not come in the strength he had hoped. Strong enough to hurt, strong enough to interfere, perhaps strong enough to save remnants, not strong enough to restore the world. He made the only sane proposal left to him. "Abandon the outer hives," he said to Cardinal Marshal Oren Vale in the command vault beneath the Basilica. "Strip them. Pull every viable regiment, every armor reserve, every medici column, every surviving food convoy. Collapse the perimeter inward around the core population zones and the extraction fields. We cannot hold the whole world." Vale stood in vestments ash-stained and stiff with sleeplessness. His eyes were fever-bright. "The Basilica of the Final Judge will not be encircled by retreat." Drave's voice hardened. "Then it will be encircled by corpses. The Saint Basilica can never fall. Everything else already has. Everything else is lesser." The general leaned over the tactical display, palms flat upon the glowing map. "If I hold your relic roads, I lose the water, approaches. If I hold your ossuary districts, I lose my gun lines. If I anchor to the Basilica at this scale, then the outer millions die with no delay bought for the inner billions. Vale's answer came like a prayer sharpened into a knife. Then let them die in service to the holy center, and not in coward flight from it. For a moment, Drave looked as though he might draw his sidearm and end the argument with murder. Severin, hearing the exchange over stolen channels, almost wished he would, but the general mastered himself. Duty still chained him where better instincts clawed. "As you command," Drave said, and the words tasted like poison even through static. The consequence came swiftly. While the relief force bled in orbit and Imperial authority devoured itself below, the Deathmongers drove hard through the districts Vale had insisted must never be yielded. Harnell's chosen cut through relic precincts already overmanned and poorly supplied. Bellicor's killers emerged from lower transit ruptures beneath shrine plazas the defenders believed secure. Cordovax's engines tore open processional arches and rolled flaming wreckage through avenues built for Saint Parades. Defensive geometry collapsed because it had been arranged for symbolism rather than survival. By the time Basilica Mortis understood what was happening, the roads to its holiest heart were gone. The processional ways leading to the Basilica of the Final Judge, those immense ceremonial avenues lined with martyr statues and triumphal arches, were in Deathmonger hands. Grey armoured figures marched through smoke and falling ash beneath banners made from flayed shrine cloth. Corpses hung from the saintly colonnades in fresh rows. Burning tanks blocked the side approaches. The defenders who had been ordered to die there had done so, and the enemy was walking over them toward the final sacred precinct. In the command vault, no one spoke for several breaths. Then the alarms began, again, louder than before. The road to the holiest place on the planet had been seized, and the death sentence of Basilica Mortis had reached its shrine-bound heart. By the time the roads to the Basilica of the Final Judge fell, the war had ceased to be planetary in the minds of the living. Basilica Mortis still burned from pole to pole. Whole hives were starving in darkness. The manufactorum belts belched black fire into a poisoned sky. Refugee wastes spread in every direction, choked with shell holes, broken vehicles, and the dead pressed into one another so tightly they resembled fresh masonry. The void above remained a furnace of drifting wrecks and dueling batteries. Millions still fought. Billions still feared. Yet the shape of the war had narrowed with the merciless logic of ritual. Every surviving prayer, every command order, every trembling hope, every cry for vengeance, and every oath of hatred bent now toward one place. The Basilica. It rose from the inner shrine, district like the fossilized corpse of a god. Tier on tier of buttress-crowned towers climbed through smoke and ash into the storm front. Processional stairs broad enough for regiment columns climbed toward bronze gates, 100 men high. Reliquary domes bulged from the flanks like armoured hearts. Statuary lined every ledge and parapet. Saints, judges, martyrs, confessors, and executioners, all staring down over the burning city with blind stone faces. Beneath that mountain of piety, vaults housed bones, parchments, reliquaries, judge seals, censers, verdict tablets, and the preserved writings of the saintly arbiters, whose words had ruined chapters and worlds alike in the name of faith. Varkul Mordain stood upon the broken roof of a processional tower and looked at it as one might look upon a childhood tormentor, discovered old and sleeping. The warband gathered around him amidst shell bursts and wind-blown ash. Harnell stood to his right, his talons dark and clean at once, as though blood feared to cling to him for too long. Bellicor crouched upon a fallen angel statue to the left, knives resting across his knees, helm tipped toward the Basilica with naked hunger. Cordavax loomed behind them beneath a halo of mechadendrites and trailing cables, the heat shimmer from his iron harness making the air around him writhe. Chosen, breachers, gun serfs, and standard bearers ringed the height in silence while the last light of the burning day crawled across their grey armour. Below them, the avenues to the Basilica were layered with the dead in such numbers that tank tracks no longer bit stone. They bit flesh, cloth, bone, and pulverised armour. Varkal raised one gauntlet toward the Basilica, and for a moment, even the shelling seemed to withdraw from the air. "That," he said, "is the wound made stone." No one interrupted him. That place was not built to honour mercy. It was built to enshrine judgment. Those vaults hold the writings and bones of men who named themselves pure enough to condemn whole brotherhoods. They clothed cowardice as sanctity and called it divine discernment. They cast us into the abyss and crowned the sentence with incense. His voice hardened into iron. "I did not come to this world for its manufacturums. I did not come for its tithes. I did not come for another rotting hive to fly above our fleet. I came for that." The last word struck like a hammer blow. Harnal inclined his helm in grave amusement. "Then let us take it breathing." Bellicor spat a gobbet of clotted blood from his vox grill onto the stone at his feet. "Breathing is delay." "Breathing is theatre," Harnal replied. "Imagine it, brother. Their holiest chambers taken intact. The relic halls crowded with their defenders, pinned open and made to confess to every remaining vox tower. Choir stalls filled with flayed officers hanging like banners. The saint vaults running red in every picked feed across the planet." Bellicor stood in one savage movement. "You prattle of arrangement while guns still fire. A basilica is not a stage. It is a throat. Cut it." Harnal's talons flexed. "And you mistake appetite for strategy." "I mistake your vanity for weakness." The air between them became thin with murder. Warriors nearby shifted their grips upon bolters and axes, not from fear of an order, but from the knowledge that when such men chose to kill one another, the spray could be indiscriminate. Varkal did not turn. "You will both have your wish." That stilled them. He pointed first to the great western approaches, plazas of martyr statuary and broad avenue lines where Drave's last armour would inevitably gather. "Bellicor, break the outer defences. I want the avenues drowned, fast, loud, crude if need be." Then he pointed to the upper terraces and reliquary wings, where picked towers and vox masts still clawed the sky. "Harnal, take the galleries and signal architecture intact, where possible. Once the doors fail, the Basilica will become your sermon." Bellicor gave a grunt that might have been satisfaction or contempt. Harnal bowed by a fraction. Cordavax broke in then, his voice full of old irritation. "And when we have the district, do I leave the generator shrines and subcrypt magazines in one piece for your spectacle, Lord? Or do I do as you have done in every other quarter and salt the wound beyond repair?" Varkal turned to him at last. "Rig everything." A dry metallic hiss escaped the warpsmith. "Of course. If the Basilica is denied us in completion," Varkal said, "then its bones go to the abyss with it." Below, inside the holiest walls of Basilica Mortis, Cardinal Marshal Oren Vale made ready for martyrdom as if it were a coronation. He had withdrawn into the reliquary vaults beneath the Basilica's central transept with his chosen confessors, relic guards, and what remained of the inner choir. Bronze gates 3, men thick, had been sealed behind them. Ancient locks engaged, prayer wards lit, sacred oils were poured across the thresholds in rivers. The cardinal had exchanged battle robes for vestments of judgment white and ash black, stitched with the names of saints, judges, and martyrs whose lives he believed now leaned from eternity to observe his final hour. The vault around him glowed with reflected candlelight from 1,000 vigil stands. Bone cases lined the walls. Judge seals rested beneath crystal. Scroll caskets made from saint vertebrae sat upon iron tables. Around the central altar rose the great reliquary columns that held the preserved writings of the holy arbiters, parchment and skin vellum wrapped in jeweled housings, every word guarded as if it were a fragment of the emperor's own breath. The choir was smaller now, perhaps 200 voices, all male, all ragged with smoke and exhaustion, yet still singing the canticles of endurance with a grim, breathless fervour. Some trembled. Some wept while they sang. One old confessor's hands shook so badly that he smeared the sign of the aquila across his own brow with blood where his nails had cut the skin. Vale saw none of it as weakness. To him, this was sanctification. A relic guard captain knelt before him in polished carapace armour already chipped and blackened by battle. "My Lord Cardinal," the captain said, "Lord General Drave requests release of the inner vault reserve. He says he requires every last cell, every body, every emplacement if the nave approaches are to be held." Vale lifted a golden judge seal from the altar and closed it in his fist. "The reserve remains. My lord, with respect, if the upper defense fails, then the reserve will die here behind locked doors. They were chosen for this place. Their blood belongs to its defense." The captain bowed his head, but pain rippled through the movement. "Yes, my lord." Vale looked upon the relic columns and spoke, with the serenity of a man who had mistaken self-inflicted ruin for purity. "Let the enemy spend himself against the holy core. If we are buried beneath these stones, then we are buried in victory. Martyrdom is not loss." Far above that buried certainty, Lord General Castor Drave and Commissar Hest Varro assembled the last coherent blade left to the world. They built the defense not from hope, but from whatever had not yet been pulverized. Shattered regiments reduced to composite battalions, armor companies down to a handful of tanks each, shrine militias who had survived by stubbornness, not training, grenadier cadres with half their officers dead, heavy weapon sections dragged from broken curtain lines, Medicae orderlies carrying rifles because there were no more unbloodied hands to spare. The avenues around the Basilica became trenches of marble, ferrocrete, shell casings, tank wrecks, and smashed devotional stone. Drave moved through those lines like a man already walking, his own epitaph. He did not waste words on piety. He placed anti-armor teams at choke mouths, overlapping arcs across stair ascents and archway spans. He positioned tanks nose in between saint statues, hulls half-masked by rubble, guns trained down the avenues. He ordered reserve lines marked in blood chalk through reliquary plazas, and warned every company commander that withdrawal without command would earn the commissariat before the enemy could. Where walls had cracked, he made them bastions. Where doors had shattered, he turned the breach points into kill wells. Varro followed in his wake like the hard shadow of discipline itself. His greatcoat was ragged now. One sleeve had been stitched at the shoulder where shrapnel had opened it and the flesh beneath. He still carried himself like a verdict. A shrine militia lieutenant, no more than a boy beneath the soot and exhaustion, knelt beside a heavy bolter pit while his hands shook too badly to load the belt. Varro stopped before him. "Name?" "Lieutenant Salvin, sir." Varro looked at the boy's trembling fingers. "Are you afraid, Lieutenant Salvin?" The youth swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Good. Fear is proof that your soul recognizes the scale of duty laid upon it. It is not permission to fail. Salvern nodded, almost choking on the motion. Varro placed a fresh belt of shells into the lieutenant's hands and closed the boy's fingers over it. You will hold until I tell you otherwise. If you run, I will shoot you. If you stand, perhaps the enemy will do it for me. Either way, your usefulness is measured in moments. Spend them well. He moved on. The boy loaded the weapon with steadier hands. The battle for the Basilica began in full when dusk and fire merged into one bloody atmosphere. Bellicor struck first. His slaughter cult came up the western processional avenues behind a rolling wall of smoke, exploding fuel carriers, and the black-limbed silhouettes of demon engines. Heavy bolter fire from the steps scythed into them at once, blowing cultists apart in sprays of steaming gore and knocking lesser mortals from their feet in chunks. Bellicor did not slow. He bounded over the dead and the dismembered with knives low, grey armour struck by lass fire from 100 muzzle flashes. Around him, chain axes rose and fell. Breachers slammed melter charges against shrine doors. A defiler lobbed a shell into a saint colonnade and brought half the statues down in a thunder of broken halos and pulverized stone. The avenue became a shrine to reciprocal murder. Lehman rust tanks fired point blank through statuary, battle cannon rounds tearing masonry saints apart and smashing into advancing demon engines behind them. Basiliscan incense braziers toppled and rolled, burning down the stairs, setting the dead alight where they lay. Censers swung on broken chains through the smoke like brazen skulls. Heavy bolters hammered from gallery mouths. Mortars burst among choir, stalls carried out as makeshift barricades. Corpse piles rose against the bronze gates where attackers had fallen too thickly to drag clear. Prometheum washed over them and turned them into blazing hills of meat. Bellicor reached the first line in a burst of impossible speed. He vaulted a burning ammunition crate, landed on the glacis of a wounded tank, and drove both blades down through the commander's hatch into the man beneath. Blood and grey matter fountained upward around the hilts. He ripped one knife free, rammed it into the driver slit, and then leapt as the tank shuddered under internal panic. When he hit the ground, he crashed shoulder first into a shrine militia knot, breaking one man's spine against a marble plinth before gutting another from hip to navel. A third managed to scream a prayer and stab upward with a bayonet. Bellicor caught the shaft under one arm, snapped it, and buried the broken end through the militiaman's eye. Through another avenue, Harnal came, like a whispered blasphemy. He did not seek the fastest route. He sought the visible one. His chosen climbed the upper terraces and vaulted through picked cloisters, signal towers, and reliquary galleries, slaughtering signal crews, ecclesiarchal wardens, and gallery defenders with the cold patience of ritualists. Where Bellicor left ruin in heaps, Harnal left declarations. He pinned a relic guard officer to a processional arch, with both arms spread wide, and opened his torso, so the lungs sagged out like wet pink banners. He had 3 confessors strung by the throat from a choir loft above the nave, their bare feet twitching above the smoke, while their blood ran in neat vertical lines down the marble behind them. He ordered picked relays reactivated not to transmit warnings, but images. Across the surviving Vox and picked net, Basilica Mortis watched its own defenders become ornaments. Bellicor voxed him then, breath harsh with exertion and delight. You still paint while the killing waits. Harnal answered over the roar of gunfire and chanting machine noise. I kill the waiting itself. You indulge yourself. I educate them. On what? On despair. Bellicor laughed, a deep, ugly sound. I prefer simpler lessons. Their rivalry sharpened, but true to Varkal's decree, it did not break into disobedience. Where Bellicor smashed open a breach, Harnal exploited the panic beyond it. Where Harnal fixed the defender's gaze upon some impossible obscenity, Bellicor used the hesitation to close and butcher. They despised each other's instincts, and yet each made the other deadlier. Severan Hale received his own order in the midst of that hell. Cordovax summoned him below the Basilica with curt machine cant and 2 chained escorts. Severan was dragged through a side ingress, blown open by breacher charges, and down into the understructure beneath the shrine district, through crypt passages where the air tasted of old incense, wet stone, and fresh cordite. The lower levels of the Basilica were another city hidden under sanctity. Burial vaults, catacomb roads, maintenance sanctums, reactor shrines bound in prayer plates, munitions crypts stocked for siege reserve, ossuary halls lined with generations of sanctified dead. Cordovax had infested them all. The warpsmith moved through that underworld like a plague of iron. Servitor crawlers skittered over reactor housings, welding detonation chains into coolant conduits. Melter charges were nested inside burial alcoves beneath rows of judge bones. Munitions crypts had been opened and rewired so that one ignition pulse would turn their contents into a district-wide firestorm. Even the catacomb pillars bore drilled cavities stuffed with shaped explosives and sacrificial machine spirits bound to die screaming when the signal came. Severan stood transfixed as Cordovax pointed him toward a relay shrine. "You will carry the final arming litany to the upper net when ordered," the warpsmith said. Severan found his voice only with effort. "Lord, this will tear down the whole district." Cordovax's augmetic face clicked in what might once have been a smile. "Yes. Then why fight for the Basilica at all? Because the Lord desires desecration before annihilation." Cordovax watched his servo constructs drive blasting rods into the base of a sepulchral column. "And because if the enemy wins here, I will not let him inherit so much as a buried femur without paying in blood." Another charge was set into a reliquary foundation. Sacred dust puffed into the lantern light. Severan realized then that the entire Basilica district had already been condemned from beneath. Every avenue fight above, every prayer, every countercharge, every act of faith or hatred, all of it unfolded over a grave with the lid unsealed. Above, as the outer gates buckled and the nave galleries ran red, Varkal ascended the captured Vox Tower of the northern transept and took the world's remaining voice in his fist. The transmission rolled across Basilica Mortis through failing speakers, half-shattered shrine Vox masts, emergency military channels, and the cracked public address systems of Habs already half buried in dust. "People of Basilica Mortis," he said, his words carried over thunder, gunfire, and the breaking of ancient doors. "Your saints did not save you when they had power. They will not save you now that they are bones." He let the line breathe just long enough for hatred to become certainty. "We stand upon the judgment they built. We will break it. Remember that when your priests tell you the Imperium endures, it endures only in the lie that others will die for it." Inside the reliquary vaults, the choir faltered but did not stop. Cardinal Vale lifted his seal higher and ordered them louder. Around him, relic guards took position behind overturned reliquary tables and ancient sarcophagus bases, their faces drawn and hollow in the candlelit gloom. The cardinal's own voice rose into prayer until it became almost a scream. On the avenues, Drave saw the outer stairlines beginning to fail. He voxed for reserves that did not exist. Varro shot a man trying to crawl away from his post, and then climbed into the firing step himself to drag the heavy stubber back onto target. Tanks burned nose to nose with demon engines beneath St. Arches. Body parts struck the Basilica doors and slid down them in smoking streaks. The war had become exactly what it had always promised to be, a holy place made into a slaughterhouse so complete that even the smoke tasted reverent. Then the storm front above the shrine district convulsed. Every eye that could still turn upward did so through smoke, tracer fire, drifting ash, and the burning fall of orbital debris. At first it seemed another rain of wreckage. Then the shapes resolved. Thunderhawks, black against the furnace sky, descending in spearhead formation there. Engines punching holes through cloud and cinder. Loyalist craft, imperial, fast, direct, and descending with the iron refusal of men who had chosen the hardest landing because it was the necessary one. Their arrival tore a ragged cry from what remained of the defenders. The gunships came in low over the upper transepts, shrugging off tracer wash and flak bursts, assault ramps already lit within. On the nearest cockpit feed seized by the Vox pit, Severin saw the warriors waiting in the hold. Yellow armor, hard-edged helms, bolter's mag locked to breastplates. Faces where shown were carved from old stone and younger fury alike. No waste, no bluster, no ornament beyond duty. At the forefront of the lead craft stood Captain Rolth Severin of the Imperial Fists. One gauntlet braced against the overhead rail. The other rested upon the pommel of a sheathed blade, while warning runes crawled red across the hold around him. His voice, when it came across the assault channel, was flat as a siege hammer. "We land at the nave approaches. Breach, secure, advance. The Basilica is reclaimed in blood, or not at all." The Thunderhawks punched through the storm and committed to the heart of the war. The Thunderhawks did not come like saviors. They came like a correction. Their engines tore through the ash storm over the Basilica district with a disciplined violence the defenders had not heard since the first hours of the invasion. No theatrical challenge preceded them. No Vox amplified litany rolled from the holds. They crossed the burning air low and direct, split formation to avoid the worst of the flak, then drove into the landing zones that still existed with the grim inevitability of breaching charges placed by hands that had already calculated the cost. Their ramps hit stone, and the Imperial Fists came out. Yellow ceramite, blackened by atmospheric entry and dusted in the grey ash of a dying shrine world, seemed at first almost too stark a colour for the place. Then they moved, and colour ceased to matter. They were spare of speech, spare of gesture, and mercilessly exact. Fire teams broke at once into angles of coverage. Heavy weapon pairs locked down breach mouths and gallery lines without being told twice. Veterans advanced in hard measured bounds through smoke, rubble, corpse heaps, and toppled statuary, every movement paired to function. Their bolters did not bark in panic or fury. They fired in controlled verdicts. One target, one burst, shift, advance, secure. For the first time since planetfall, the Deathmongers met something that imposed real tactical pressure on them. Rolth Severin led from the front because an Imperial Fists captain would do little else in such a place. His helm lenses burned cold emerald through the ash haze. The blade at his side remained sheathed for the opening minutes of the counter-assault, while his bolter did its work. He did not raise his voice. He did not sermonize. His orders came clipped and absolute. Over the assault channel. Right transept secured. Breach left. Contain upper gallery. Advance. Seal that fire lane. Kill the guns first. Move. His veterans obeyed with the eerie efficiency of men who had long ago made peace with narrow corridors, falling masonry, and the cost of taking fortifications one room at a time. They reclaimed ground exactly as their kind should, not by grand charge, but by kill corridor, one blood-soaked chamber after another. Rubble choked the nave approaches. They turned the rubble into cover. Corpses hung from choir arches. They shot through the swinging dead to strike the killers beyond. Flame washed down reliquary halls. They went through it, armour blackening, bolters raised, every metre paid for and accounted. The first Deathmongers caught in that advance died hard and fast. A breacher knot under one of Harnal's lieutenants tried to hold a smashed processional arch with chain blades and scavenged shield plates. The Imperial fists did not oblige them with melee. Crack grenades reduced the shields to flying wreckage, and disciplined bolt fire chewed through the exposed grey plate beneath. One traitor was blown open at the ribs, lungs and black blood spraying across the saint carving behind him. Another lost his helm to a point-blank shell and stumbled on for 2 more steps, with the front of his skull gone before gravity remembered him. A third tried to crawl away, dragging both ruptured legs, and was pinned to the floor by 3 further rounds that turned his spine into red ruin. The Deathmongers answered with the fury of men denied an easy kill. Bellicor found the Imperial fists in the western nave breach, and at once discovered that brutality alone did not grant supremacy. He had butchered militia, guardsmen, priests, and shrine wardens like meat on hooks. Even when faced with harder foes, he had relied on speed, terror, and the willingness to wade through punishment lesser killers would avoid. The Imperial fists did not give him the fear he fed upon. They gave him angles, timing, and return violence equal in savagery, if not in theatricality. He hit their forward file as a living shell, knives out, boots spattering in blood and shattered marble dust. His first strike drove toward the throat seal of the lead veteran. The Imperial fist caught the wrist, turned into the impact, and rammed his helm into Bellicor's faceplate hard enough to crack one lens. A second fist fired point blank into Bellicor's breastplate. The shell detonated against the ceramite and threw him half sideways in a burst of shrapnel and black blood. But he did not fall. He answered by burying one blade through the gun muzzle and into the firing marine's gauntlet, pinning hand to weapon, then slammed his other knife under the pauldron joint. The fight became ugly at once. There was no room for glory in the nave breach. Blind corners, collapsed pews, hanging bodies, smoke thick with burning incense, and atomized meat, shell bursts flashing white against gilded columns. All of it crushed the combat inward until it became a series of blade locks, shoulder checks, snapped wrists, point-blank bolter detonations, and armour failing by the inch. Bellicor took a chainsword across the thigh and hacked the wielder's knee backward in return. An Imperial fist lost his combat knife arm at the elbow and simply switched his bolt pistol to the remaining hand, firing until Bellicor's cult dragged him down. Another locked Bellicor blade to blade against a shattered reliquary plinth, while a third veteran tried to force a bolt round under the traitor's gorget. Bellicor bit through his own vox grill in effort, head-butted the nearest helm, and drove both men backward into a corpse rack that came down in a thunder of splintered bone cases and hanging dead. He was checked, not stopped, but checked. The distinction enraged him more than pain. Across the upper galleries, Harnal made the Basilica itself into a weapon. He knew the Imperial fists would not break at spectacle alone, so he layered spectacle with geometry. Corpses were hung across narrow firing lanes to spoil sightlines and force hesitation. Burning banners were cut loose at chosen moments so they collapsed over advancing squads in walls of flaming cloth, blinding optics and choking air intakes. Choir balconies, already weakened by artillery, were left apparently intact until the weight of methodical advance brought them down in cascades of stone, metal, and dismembered bodies. Blind corners concealed not merely shooters, but butchered defenders rigged with grenades in their open torsos, so that the dead themselves exploded when the loyalists tried to clear them. Every metre through the nave and reliquary galleries cost blood. The imperial fists adapted because that was their nature. They cut around corpse curtains. They used thermal scans where sight failed. They collapsed suspect balconies with deliberate fire before advancing under them. Yet adaptation was not immunity. A veteran was dragged from a side passage by 3 hanging hook chains attached to deadweight corpses above, jerked from his feet, and finished by Harnal's talons through the visor before his brothers could bring fire to bear. Another squad entered a side reliquary and found the floor slick, not with blood alone, but sacred oils and marrow, making their footing treacherous for the half-second Harnal required to carve one marine open from shoulder to hip. He left that one hanging from a saint niche with his gene-enhanced entrails uncoiling over a bronze martyr face. Routh Severin saw the maze for what it was and did not waste breath cursing it. "Burn the galleries out," he ordered. Flamers answered. Controlled detonations followed. The upper reaches of the Basilica began to burn in earnest, and thick choking smoke rolled down through the nave in curtains. Harnal vanished in it like a murderer stepping behind a veil, still present, still killing, but never where the next shot expected him. Far below, in the Basilica understructure, Cordovax received the final command to arm the district for death. He stood amidst reactor shrines draped in explosive cable, burial vaults stuffed with munitions, and catacomb pillars turned to shape charges, and for the first time since Severin had known him, the warpsmith sounded almost tired. "It could have served," he said. Severin knelt by the relay shrine, hands on the arming keys, every nerve alive with the awareness that he sat above the grave of millions. Cordovax's mechadendrites coiled and uncoiled in irritation. This world, these reserves, these dock remains, these manufacturums, even ruined it could have served. Varkul's voice came over the command channel from above, harsh with exertion and utterly unmoved. "Useful is for empires. We are the wound they made." Cordovax closed his eyes behind augmetic lenses that no longer needed the gesture. "Then let the wound gape." He activated the final detonation sequence. Across the understructure, rune lights shifted from amber to the deep arterial red of imminent death. Charges armed. Reactor governors accepted false liturgies as command truths. Crypt magazines awakened to treachery in their own shells. The Basilica district began to count down toward obliteration, though only the damned beneath knew it. In the reliquary chamber, Cardinal Marshal Oren Vale met his end without glory. The last of his relic guards had formed a shrinking ring around the central altar, where the bones and verdict writings of the holy judges lay in their jeweled housings. The choir was reduced to a handful of blood-streaked men whose voices had shredded into hoarse whispers of prayer. Smoke seeped beneath the vault doors. Bolt impacts hammered the bronze. One hinge had already split. Vale stood before the altar in torn vestments, holding the great judge seal of office in both hands, as if it were a weapon and a sacrament both. His eyes shone with fever. Even then he believed meaning would descend to crown the hour. When the doors finally broke, they did so inward in a rain of metal shards, burning oil, and splintered locking teeth. Bellicor's killers came through one side, Harnal's chosen through the other, and the chamber became a butcher's nightmare lit by candlelight and muzzle flash. Relic guards died where they stood, one gutted against a bone column, another beheaded by Harnal so neatly that the head remained upright for a heartbeat after the body had already fallen. A confessor tried to raise a censure burner and had his arm torn off at the shoulder. The choir scattered and was cut down among the relic plinths, their blood slicking the marble around the saintly bones they had died defending. Vale did not flee. He lifted the judge seal and cried out a final sentence of condemnation, invoking the very arbiters whose parchments lay behind him in gold and crystal. Bellicor reached him first but did not kill him. He struck the seal from the cardinal's hands and drove him to his knees with a knife hilt across the jaw. Harnal arrived a breath later, eyes hidden behind helm lenses, talons delicate as surgical tools. "How fitting," Harnal said. He seized Vale by the throat and forced him backward across the altar. Bone caskets shattered beneath the cardinal's spine. Jeweled reliquaries skittered across the floor. Then Harnal used the symbols the man had trusted. He rammed a broken judge scepter through the cardinal's open mouth and out the back of the neck, pinning him to the altar stone. He drove sharpened fragments of reliquary crystal into both eyes. He split the white and black vestments down the chest and spread them apart with hooked blades until the ribcage showed slick and pale beneath. Cardinal Marshal Oren Vale died gargling blood over the saint bones he believed would vindicate him. There was no redemption in it, no avenging light, only desecration answering certainty. Elsewhere, Lord General Castor Drave held the final line long enough for tens of thousands to run. The inner processional avenue below the eastern transept had become the last organized withdrawal corridor left to the world. Civilians, wounded soldiers, and whatever medici teams still functioned were being driven through it toward makeshift extraction fields under the cover of tank wrecks and collapsing statuary. Drave stood there amidst the retreat, cloak burned away, one arm hanging useless from a shattered pauldron plate, issuing fire corrections through lips split by shrapnel. He had long ceased believing in salvation. What remained to him was arithmetic. Each minute held meant more bodies through the corridor. Each tank brought another wave. Each dead company commander still obeying from reflex saved strangers he would never know. Varro remained at his side until a bolt burst tore the commissar from the firing step and hurled him into the smoke with half his torso opened. Drave did not look away. He could not afford the courtesy. When the Deathmongers hit the avenue again, he took a rifle from a dead trooper and fired it himself, old and mortal amid giants and monsters, until a shell burst from a demon engine hammered fragments through his chest and side. He sagged against a broken Saint plinth, breath bubbling red, and still he voxed for the next line to hold. "Keep them moving," he rasped to no one and everyone. "Keep them moving." By then, Varkul Mordain had reached the Saint Vault. Routh Severin was already there. The chamber was a forest of bones and judgment. Reliquary columns rose from floor to vaulting, packed with caskets, scroll tubes, preserved finger bones, skull masks, tablets of censure, and the writings of dead holy men who had once pronounced damnation with clean hands. Much of it had already been broken open in the fighting. Bone fragments crunched under armoured, boots, scrolls burned in drifting heaps, incense smoke tangled with cordite and blood mist until the air itself felt thick enough to clot. Routh Severin stood amidst it with 3 veterans still alive near him, bolter empty, blade drawn at last. Varkul entered over the bodies of the last defenders, chainglaive in hand. Neither man offered challenge, neither offered speech fit for banners. They simply closed. The first impact of blade on chain glaive threw sparks across St. Bones. Routh moved like a siege engine given human shape, economical, direct. Each cut meant to open a line toward the kill. Varkal fought like history turned feral, heavier, more vicious. Every swing of Grief Render designed not merely to kill, but to obliterate the dignity of the thing struck. They smashed through reliquary columns, shattered bone cases underfoot, and hacked one another among the dead witnesses of old judgments. Routh scored Varkal across the breastplate and opened the flesh beneath. Varkal answered with the chain glaive's teeth along the Imperial Fist Captain's hip and tore a chunk of yellow ceramite away with the meat under it. They locked close, armor grinding, breath harsh through vox grills. Two irreconcilable faiths trying to cut the other out of existence in a room built by the long dead. Around them, the surviving veterans and chosen murdered one another in silence, broken only by impact, choking, and gunfire too close to echo properly. Bellicor arrived at the northern breach, just as the Imperial fists began forcing it open from the outer gallery. He was already mauled. One arm bled from a split joint. His chest plate was cratered. A deep crack ran down one side of his helm, where some loyalist blade had nearly found his skull. Yet the sight of another breach did not breed caution in him. It bred devotion of the ugliest kind. He took stock in a glance. Corpses everywhere, loose explosives, broken statuary, narrow approach. Enough. He ordered his few, surviving killers back, then dragged the dead into the gap with his own hands, piling bodies, armor fragments, shattered pew timbers, and demolition charges into a grotesque barricade. Imperial fists fired through the smoke and struck him again and again while he worked. One round burst his shoulder plate, another tore meat from his side. He only laughed, black blood dribbling from the vox grill as he rammed a chain of grenades deep into the mound of mangled flesh. A loyalist veteran pushed through the breach ahead of the others, blade raised. Bellicor met him at arm's reach, drove one knife under the chin, and used the dying weight to jam the body into the barricade itself. "Mine," he snarled, though whether he meant the breach or death itself no one could have said. When the detonators fired, the whole passage became meat and stone in motion. The blast collapsed the breach, buried loyalists and traitors alike under a hill of pulverized dead, and bought the Deathmongers the minutes Varkal needed. Below, Cordovax's arming sequence reached ignition. The reactor chain beneath the Basilica district woke like a beast under the floor of the world. One shrine overload became 3. 3 became 12. Pressure vaults burst. Crypt magazines flashed to life. Flame ran through the understructure faster than prayer, leaping from conduit to conduit, from burial chamber to fuel reserve, from munitions crypt to catacomb spine. The whole hive core began to die from below upward, as if Basilica Mortis itself were rotting from the bones outward. The first shockwave punched up through the lower transepts and split the floors of the shrine district. Streets buckled, towers lurched, mausoleum walls burst apart as fire rose out of the dead beneath them. Great cracks opened through the processional avenues and swallowed tanks, gun crews, refugees, and altar stones alike. Then the true eruption began. Columns of ash, flame, pulverized bone dust, and human remains, blasted skyward high enough to be seen far beyond the hive rings. Whole terraces folded inward. Reliquary domes lifted and came apart in the air. The Basilica, for all its age and arrogance, began to come down upon itself. Routh Severin and Varkal broke apart only because the chamber around them ceased to be a chamber and became collapse. A reliquary column exploded between them. Bone shards and gilded metal ripped through the smoke. One of Routh's surviving veterans vanished under falling vaultstone. A chosen of the Deathmongers was pulped flat beneath a descending beam. Varkal voxed the extraction order at once. Teleport flares bloomed in the side chapels and catacomb access points, harsh white bursts in the red dark. Elsewhere, surviving Deathmongers fell back through collapsing underways Cordovax had marked in advance, dragging wounded brothers and abandoning the mortally ruined where they lay. Harnal withdrew through smoke like a shadow reluctantly giving up its prey. Cordovax limped with half his mechadendrites severed, still transmitting detonation harmonics to ensure the understructure died completely. Sevran ran in chains with the retreat, stumbling through catacombs that were already folding inward, hearing the screams of trapped mortals and transhumans alike vanish under the thunder of a world ending in layers. The Imperial fists fired on them through debris and flame. Some strikes landed. Grey armor burst. Bodies fell. Yet even that disciplined fury could not hold the district together against what had been done beneath it. The Deathmongers extracted under fire through collapsing catacombs and white teleport glare while the hive city erupted behind them. From orbit, from the surviving outer hives, from the processional planes, from any point left on Basilica Mortis, where a man could still raise his eyes, the destruction was visible. Continent bright columns of fire and ash climbed into the poisoned sky. Debris the size of hab blocks rained outward in incandescent arcs. Pulverized dead drifted through the upper air like a second ashfall, grey with bone, black with soot, red where the light caught wetness not yet burned away. What Varkal had promised was made manifest then, not conquest, not seizure, not dominion, pure death and destruction. Basilica Mortis burned beyond all useful measurement. The shrine world had ceased to resemble a world ruled by men and become instead a caution etched across a globe in ash and fire. Continents lay under drifting veils of black promethium smoke so thick that daylight reached the ground only as a sick bruise of copper through the poisoned sky. Hive crowns still smouldered where they had not collapsed outright. Shrine districts were gone, in great cratered wounds, rimmed with toppled statuary and pulverized bone dust. Processional plains had become refugee gravefields, the roads invisible beneath the carcasses of tanks, pilgrims, ox-drawn ration haulers, and the dead in numbers too swollen for burial, even if the hands remained to dig. Along the coasts, the oceans had turned into industrial cemeteries, choked by wreckage, void debris, fuel slicks, broken shrine barges, and the bodies washed down in their millions from the ruined river systems and drainage channels of the hives. Across the planet, casualty estimates continue to rise because no one had the strength left to stop counting, yet the numbers had already passed beyond the limits of human imagination. They had become symbols rather than lives, tallies rather than names. Machine strings fed into prayer, cracked archives by exhausted clerks who no longer believed the final sum would matter to any power capable of reading it. In some districts, the counts would never come at all. The records had burned with the adepts who kept them. In others, populations had been reduced to such feral ruin that no distinction remained between the living who might yet die and the dead who had simply not stopped moving. Basilica Mortis had not been conquered. Conquest implied possession, continuity, utility. It had been sentenced. The surviving populations understood that, with the terrible slowness of those who have outlived the event that killed them. Food systems were ash. Water systems coughed poison. Medicaid infrastructure existed only in pockets, already drowning in infection, burns, and the first bloom of corpse-borne plague. Radiation licked from cracked reactors beneath the hive core. Civil authority remained in fragments, some military, some ecclesiarchal, some simply the brute strength of armed gangs who had found more ammunition than conscience. The shrine world had not fallen into silence. It had fallen into a lower, more enduring noise. Hunger riots, execution volleys, the hacking cough of lungs full of ash, and the far-off crump of structures still giving way under their own ruin. Above that world, the Deathmongers limped back into orbit like carrion wolves dragging themselves away from a carcass they had half devoured and half spoiled for spite. The judgment of iron listed in its course corrections. One whole flank blackened and cratered from the void ambush. Auxiliary decks remained sealed, where atmosphere loss had mummified thralls and gun crews in frozen poses of panic. The medici bays overflowed. Dead brothers lay in the holds, wrapped not in honor cloths, but stripped tarpaulins and chains, because the warband had no time left for formal reverence. Wounded champions lay on iron slabs, while armor thralls cut away cracked ceramite and bolted scavenged plates into place with the ugly haste of necessity. Magazines stood depleted. Ammunition inventories were read in grim percentages of lack rather than stock. Stolen parts from manufacturum salvage and wrecked escorts were being hammered, fused, or chained into engines and gun decks merely to keep the fleet capable of one more warp translation. Severin Hale moved among it all with a slate bound to his forearm and dried blood in the lines of his palms. He had thought once that the Deathmongers were beyond attrition because they had surrendered anything worth protecting. The lie of that belief hung around him now in every corridor. Their victories cost, their cruelty consumed. They endured not because they were untouched, but because they accepted depletion as naturally as breathing. Their fleet was an eroded thing. Their warband was smaller than it had been before the Shrine World. Their holds smelled of cauterized flesh, machine oil, void dust, and the raw copper stink of blood old and fresh together. Harnal survived. That fact spread through the ship with the strange force reserved for monsters one expects to outlive catastrophe and yet still feels relieved to confirm. He walked the gunnery galleries in re-sealed armour, one pauldron split, helm missing, a deep chain blade score crossing the lower half of his face from cheek to neck. The wound had been stapled closed with iron clips. Black blood had dried in the edges of it, and left him appearing as though he smiled through a second mouth. He stood with Severin once at a viewing slit overlooking the burning world, and watched another ash plume rise above the broken hive core. It was beautiful, Harnal said. Severin did not answer. Harnal tilted his head toward the ruined planet. Not the fire. Fire is common. Not the dead. The dead are cheaper still. The grief. His clipped lips twitched. That is what made it beautiful. We left them nothing but grief. No relic left whole enough to kiss. No victory clean enough to preach. No saintly lie that will survive first contact with memory. He touched the scar at his neck with two talons, as though testing whether it still pleased him. They will tell this story for 1,000 years, and no telling will make it smaller. Bellicor survived as well, though survival in his case wore the mockery of a medical term. He had been reduced to a butcher's breathing wreck on an iron cradle deep in the apothecarian decks. One arm had been removed from the shoulder and replaced with a crude temporary rig of clamps and injector lines, while the true augmetics were prepared. Most of one side of his chest was open beneath hissing sealants and black suture wire. His helm was gone. What remained of his face beneath the bruising and dried blood was broad, brutal, and still somehow laughing. He asked for reports, not strategic briefings, not fleet dispositions, civilian attrition, water failure in the lower hives, plague bloom in refugee camps, food riots, collapsed shelters, secondary deaths. Each fresh recitation drew from him the same sound, a low, wet laugh that ended in coughing up black clots into the basin at his side. "They keep dying," he rasped to the attending thralls after one such report. "Good, good, then the breach held." Cordovax visited the strategium late, stinking of coolant, smoke, and fresh machine, grafts. Half his remaining mechadendrites had been replaced by salvaged limbs taken from crippled servitors and loyalist wrecks. They moved with imperfect synchrony, making his silhouette seem more hateful and more weary at once. He stood before the hololithic image of the system and gazed at the cinders of the engagement without speaking until Varkul entered. "We could have ruled this system," Cordovax said at last. His voice was lower than usual, scraped near smooth by exhaustion. "The docks can be rebuilt. The worlds around it were weak. With the right pressure, tribute would have come. Fuel, stock, bodies, a base, a chain of redoubts." Varkul did not look at the map. He looked through the armoured glass beyond it, at the still burning wound of Basilica Mortis turning beneath the fleet. "Ruling a thing," he said, "is smaller than ruining it." Cordovax gave a soft metallic click. "Smaller, yes. More enduring too. We do not seek endurance. No, only witness." Varkul's scarred features hardened by a degree. "Only verdict." That ended it. Cordovax bowed with as much obedience as bitterness ever allowed him and withdrew to his engines, still unconvinced, still bound. Severan returned to the Vox pits and spent the next watches compiling what he came to think of as the World Death Reports. The work became madness by accumulation. Districts reported themselves dead twice because rival authorities each claimed the same ruins. Refugee counts contradicted one another by the million because whole columns had vanished between one transmission and the next. Military tallies listed regiments destroyed, yet fragments of those same regiments continued to transmit from shelters and rubble nests that no command structure remembered assigning them. Orbital records disagreed with ground records because transport manifests had burned, because evacuation craft had been overloaded, because some had been shot down, because some had been boarded, because some had simply been lost in the smoke and never seen again. Severan understood then that the Imperium's archives, for all their appetite for enumeration, would never truly count the dead of Basilica Mortis. The slaughter had exceeded the machinery of record. It had outpaced ledgers, censuses, manifests, adepts, and memory alike. In a century, some dry voice would read a number in a sanctified vault and think he understood what had occurred here. Severan knew he would not. The real toll existed only as absence so vast that even grief could not map it. On the broken remnants of the Basilica landing fields, Captain Routh Severin gathered what survivors he could and made departure into another form of duty. His armor was patched and blood dark. The hip wound Varkul had dealt him had been sealed under field clamps and fresh plate. Of the veterans he had landed with, too many were dead to number without inviting thought. He did not invite thought he could not use. The Imperial Fists established evacuation order with the same brutal economy they had brought to the Basilica assault. Landing zones were marked. Civilians fit for transport were driven forward in disciplined waves. The most salvageable wounded were loaded first, where triage made such choices possible. Remaining defense pockets were folded inward under covering fire. A world could not be saved now. That truth had hardened into fact beneath every bootstep through the ash. But remnants might be preserved, fragments of personnel, archives, relics stripped from secondary shrines, gene stock, command cadres, children too young to have inhaled a lifetime of poison. Routh Severin did not call it victory. No son of dawn worthy of the blood would have profaned the word in such a place. He stood at the edge of a Thunderhawk ramp while loading crews shoved another line of smoke-blackened survivors into the hold, and watched the horizon, where the hive core still burned in pillars high enough to stain the stratosphere. A surviving officer of the Astra Militarum, his face wrapped in blood-soaked dressings, paused beside him. "We held enough, Lord Captain," the man said, as though begging the phrase to become true. Routh's answer was stone. "We saved remnants." The officer bowed his head because there was no cruelty in the statement, only accounting. When the last practical extraction windows narrowed and the void above grew more hostile with drifting wreckage and returning traitor fire, Varkle took the system Vox for the final time. His voice spread not only to the wounded world beneath, but across the surviving relief ships, evacuation craft, outer pickets, and any listening station still capable of receiving signal through the ionized ruin. "Hear me, Basilica Mortis. Hear me, carrion heirs of St. Basilius. Hear me, judges of terror, inquisitors of ash, priests who sanctify sentences while others bleed beneath them." The transmission rolled on through, static and distant weapons fire. "You name men impure and cast them into damnation, then call the consequence heresy when it returns. You build shrines upon verdicts and bones and imagine yourselves innocent because the fire comes later." He paused only long enough for the silence to sharpen the next words. "St. Basilius, all imperial judges, all who wear righteousness as armor while condemning others to the abyss. You are the architects of this slaughter." Then his voice deepened into the old wound-made law. "You made us in judgment. We answer in extinction." The signal cut. No rebuttal followed. None possible would have survived the weight of the world turning below. At last the fleet made ready to leave. Warp engines rose in their throats like caged storms. Translational rites were muttered over cracked consoles and blood-marked circuit shrines. Great hulls adjusted course by fractions, shepherding the most wounded escorts into formation, abandoning those too broken to carry their own mass. In the holds, the dead remained chained where they lay. In the Medicaid decks, the maimed muttered, laughed, or slept under pain suppressors. In the Vox pits, the final reports continued to arrive from Basilica Mortis, even as departure runes flashed readiness, fires still spreading, shelters collapsing, mobs tearing apart supply depots, plague markers rising, more die-off in the east hives, more starvation in the processional wastes, more violence in the name of survival and faith, and simple animal refusal to lie down quietly. Severin listened until the last possible moment. Then the fleet slipped from real space. One by one, grey warships edged in brass and furnace light vanished into the wound they tore in the void, carrying their dead, their injured, their spite, and their verdict away from the world they had unmade. No occupation remained behind them, no order, no triumph standard planted over a subdued population, only burning hives, poisoned, skies, ruined shrines, and survivors condemned to inherit the long afterlife of the massacre. Basilica Mortis still burned when the last traitor vessel disappeared. It would burn long after. And what the Deathmongers left behind was not conquest, not dominion, not even war in its ordinary sense, but exactly what their name promised: pure death and destruction.